Greetings, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of City Lights Live, the online expression of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and today we are delighted to have with us Robin Peguero, celebrating the publication of his new novel, One in the Chamber, published by Grand Central Publishing. The background of the novel is Capitol Hill culture, and Robin Peguero's storytelling dives into the intrigues and political wheeling and dealing in the country's seat of power. With an insider's understanding, he traverses the political landscape, generating a page-turner, blending intrigue with high-minded political and legal ideas. The characters of the novel are embroiled in a compelling political mystery that culminates in a provocative crescendo. Robin Peguero is a novelist and an attorney who spent 7 years as a trial lawyer. Most recently, he served as a homicide prosecutor in Miami, Florida. His writing is infused with a certain nuance and flair, which comes from having worked in Capitol Hill. He was also a press spokesman in the U.S. House and a speechwriter for the U.S. Senate before becoming an attorney. He has served as a U.S. House Investigative Counsel working on domestic terrorism and is currently chief of staff to a member of Congress. His writings have appeared in the Miami Herald, the Harvard Crimson, and the Harvard Law Review. He is the author of the novel With Prejudice. One in the Chamber is his second novel. Joining him in conversation will be Lauren Shade, the community manager at Novel Suspects, and also assistant marketing director at Hachette Book Group. Novel Suspects is a community of crime readers that comes together to celebrate the various genres of crime fiction. It originated at Hachette Publishing and features the work of such writers as Walter Mosley, George Pelecanos, David Woodrell, amongst others. So we've posted links with which you may purchase the book in event description. It's a pleasure to be able to bring you now Robin Peguero and Lauren Shade. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you,
so much.
Peter. Appreciate it.
So I guess we can just dive in, right?
Let's do it.
Really hard to follow up with such the background. Oh my gosh. And I'm excited to chat with you about your sophomore novel, One in the Chamber. And I mean, first and foremost, I have so many questions, especially with your rich background. And I'm just going to hold the cover up because it's gorgeous. And I think the cover designers at GCP get some credit here. But how did the idea come around, and like from writing With Prejudice to your sophomore novel, One in the Chamber? How did you get this idea? How was the writing experience a little bit different? Did you learn anything from your first novel that you've incorporated into this second novel? I'd love to know the details.
Yeah, so, I guess since I was young, they sort of teach you write what you know, right? And so I like to draw heavy from my experience, what I'm doing professionally at the moment, and try to highlight or expose something about that field, about that arena, that isn't well known. And so with Prejudice, at the time, I was a homicide prosecutor. I was hearing dramatic stories of people, brutally murdered, their families trying to cope with it in the aftermath, and then a defendant on trial, and his family coping with that. I was hearing those stories every day, and I thought this is ripe for a story, a fiction novel, sort of looking at the jurors in that case, because of how I had come to feel that, jurors were the most important unknown black box characters in a courtroom, and in novels and in movies. They very rarely have names. They very rarely have identities, although their identities and their worldviews and their backgrounds are ultimately what dictate what verdict is going to be handed down. And so that was my motivation heading into With Prejudice. And with One in the Chamber, I had spent, 4 years on Capitol Hill previously, but at the time that I was writing it, I had returned to Capitol Hill, as noted, to be a lawyer on the January 6th committee, as well as chief of staff for a member of Congress. I've since left DC, actually, and I'm back in Miami. But having that experience, particularly being, management, managing a team of 14 staffers, I'm going from junior staffer to chief of staff over the course of, 7 total years. But I started when I was 21, fresh out of college. And it's just such an interesting world to me, Capitol Hill is, because there are basically kids running it, right? There are people right out of college who are the ones corresponding with constituents, who are the ones taking calls, writing letters. And you move up pretty fast also, depending on which sort of, if you're in the House or in the Senate. And so there's an interesting culture there on Capitol Hill. Staffers are known to be overworked, underpaid, and in many cases maltreated. Right? There's a lot of drama there with these 20-somethings, and trying to make it in Washington D.C. And so that's what sort of dawned on me that I wanted to kind of expose, was that sort of culture where staffers are at times complaining about their bosses, or have a real distaste for their bosses, who I'm sure you've seen stories. They can be egomaniacal. They can sort of ask them to do tasks that aren't official, like pick up their laundry or pick up their lunches, which in many cases is not official duties. It's not something that staffers are supposed to be asked to do. And so I wanted to really highlight that, and I thought it would be interesting to center it around, a murder of a politician. I think I'm trying to make a commentary on, unfortunately, the normalization of political violence in this country, particularly since January 6th, and getting, to investigate that for 15 months, and seeing how, things that once seemed ludicrous or absurd, right? This is a satire, right? I wrote it in a way as to exaggerate that reality in terms of political violence. But as I was writing it, I realized that it wasn't so much an exaggeration anymore, right? We've always had political violence, back from the attempted assassination of Gerald Ford. That was a Squeaky Fromm, right, who was a Manson family devotee. So that was, wild, crazy, almost stranger than fiction, sort of tale of real life, political violence, all the way to the assassination attempted. He was actually shot, but thankfully not killed, of Ronald Reagan, who, again, he had done it, that person, because he was infatuated with Jodie Foster and wanted to get her attention. And so there's always been these wild stories that have developed in real life. But I think now the problem is that this sort of normalization of violence is coming from the top, right? There are political leaders who encourage it. There was Donald Trump when he came onto the scene, when he was holding his political rallies, would say, if there was anyone demonstrating in the crowd in the rally, a counter protester to the rally, knock him out and I'll pay your legal fees, right? So right from the beginning of his ascension to political life, there was this normalization of political violence. And then, of course, it culminated in what happened on January 6th. So I wanted to expose that. I wanted to write about that. I wanted, as I said, to exaggerate it, to be a funhouse mirror being held up to the political culture in DC. And I think, unfortunately, by the time I was done writing it, it felt a lot less exaggerated and a lot more like true life.
Yeah, I mean, I would say first reading it myself, I was surprised. I went into it thinking it was like a dark humor. And I got that with the characters who reminded me, and I was glad to see a reviewer also mention that, of sort of a Donna Tartt-ish, A Secret History trope of people. But I'm curious why choose crime fiction of all genres to sort of delve into the really nuanced topics that you do in this book, because there are so many other genres that could capture it well. What attracted you to crime fiction in particular, in using suspense as a backdrop to tell this story?
Yeah, no, I think ultimately it was my line of work, right? I've sort of been involved, I guess, in the periphery of murder, oddly, all my life. I recall being a young journalist, an intern with the Miami Herald, junior year of college. And, I was in the living room with a kid who had the night before, murdered his friend in a botched robbery. And I didn't know it at the time. I was there to get a quote from him about the death of his friend. They had told police that it was that they were the victims of a robbery, when in fact they were the ones perpetrating it. And again, he shot him in sort of friendly fire and killed him. And so he was emotional, he was crying in the corner. And so I've always kind of, even from a journalist perspective, as a kid, when I was on the playground writing my stories, I was always intrigued with, I guess, the lowest points of human existence, right? When the most cardinal sin, the taking of someone else's life. These are human beings, which I always found so fascinating. I think often we talk about them as if they're monsters, as if they're subhuman, as if we could never see ourselves in that same situation. And I always felt as a prosecutor that number one was problematic, because we shouldn't ever see human beings as apart or separate, or no matter what evil even they do, we should still see the humanity in them. And I thought as a prosecutor that was important. But I also think that if you do see their actions as so far apart, as something that you would never be driven to that point, it becomes actually easier to get to that point, because you don't actively work at controlling your temper, at trying to find peaceable solutions to conflict, right? You see it as so far and away, I would never get in any sort of legal trouble like that. And so then I think that is what leads sometimes people to get into really unfortunate situations that lead to sort of, really bad things coming from that. And so I think that just lifelong kind of fascination with human being at their lowest moment. And so, when it was as a criminal prosecutor, I wrote about that and With Prejudice, and then sort of followed that thread to Capitol Hill again, where people died in the aftermath of January 6th. People were severely injured. That has always been, again, as I mentioned, part of our political culture. But I think it's really useful technique, device to use suspense, to use a murder mystery. With the book opens, we know that a senator has died, and we're trying to figure out how that happened, to whom, and by whose hand, right? Who's involved in that. And I think building on that mystery helps in terms of looking at our culture, looking at how corrosive and divisive our political culture has become, and the lengths that some people will go. There was a plot to tie up and kidnap the governor of Michigan, right? Again, something that sounds straight out of the pages of a fiction novel, but it was real life. And so I think fiction is a really creative and fun and entertaining way of talking about real issues in our culture that need addressing.
So you dig into this a little bit just now, actually, but I'm curious why homicide law, like how did that start? What was the sort of the switch that made you like, this is what I want to do? Because it seems dark, of course, we're crime fiction readers. I think we're surrounded by this in the genres, but doing it in real life is like, that's a wild experience. So, and you have these two passions, this law and writing stories, which I imagine actually go pretty hand in hand together. So I'd love to know just like your journey and how you became a homicide lawyer, and ultimately how that led to you deciding to take that next step and write your first book, and hopefully not your last second title.
Yeah. So, I think it's about storytelling. That's like the common thread runs through my work as a lawyer, as a trial attorney, and as a novelist. When you get up before a jury, you are telling a story. Obviously, as a prosecutor, thankfully, you get to tell the story that you believe happened beyond a reasonable doubt. It is a little bit different for defense attorneys who are zealously advocating for their client. So you get to, it's a story, it is the truth, but it still has to be a narrative. It still needs a beginning, middle, and an end, right? It still needs to capture their attention for them to follow, to make the logical inferences that you would like them to make from the evidence. And so that, I think, lended itself really well to writing, which again is the same. It's plot driven, right? Beginning, middle, and end. You're trying to convey an idea. You're trying to convince, sometimes, often with suspense, you're trying to convince the reader of something. Hopefully then maybe to sort of subvert those expectations and catch them off guard. And so you need to be persuasive to do that. And that's what trial work is about. It's about persuasive communication. So they really do go hand in hand. In terms of, how I decided to become a homicide prosecutor, I, went to law school knowing that I wanted to do public service. As I mentioned, I had been on the Hill for 4 years before law school, so I had only worked for the government, and that was really my true calling. I think a lot of my colleagues went off to make a lot of money at big firms, and for me, it was always about serving my community and trying to do good through my work, and so. I knew that I wanted to do that. I wanted to do public interest, and I knew that criminal law was, the most interesting law, and it was really a question of whether I wanted to be a public defender or whether I wanted to be a prosecutor. And I was actually the president of my public defender organization at Harvard Law School. And so I do think that that's where I was naturally inclined, as a progressive person, to want to defend people, often who are indigent, who don't have the resources to defend themselves, to, hold the government to account and make sure that they're proving their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Um, but what happened over the course of law school is I realized that so much of the power to do good is on the prosecutorial side. I could be the young lawyer asking another young lawyer to do the right thing. That's if I were a defense attorney, or I can just be that person, that decision maker on the prosecutorial side, whose interests are not always, one direction. They're not always the same interests as the victims. Oftentimes, you have to look out for the rights of the defendant. You have to dismiss a case if you believe you can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and certainly dismiss it if you don't believe certainly the defendant is guilty, or that you have enough evidence to convict him, even if you're pretty sure he is guilty. So knowing that, that pursuit to just for pursuing justice, a higher calling, making sure that you're only following the truth and doing the right thing by all of the players in the system, really spoke to me, and that's why I decided to become a prosecutor. And then over the course of my time there, just as you move up in the office, you go from lower level crimes to higher level crimes, on ultimately culminating and having a docket of exclusively homicides. Right. Again, it's the most important of crimes in the state system, the one that takes the most time, where you put in the most effort, and that leads sometimes to the harshest consequences for the defendant. And so knowing that those were the most important cases that you can treat, and that often these victims, the people who have died, their memories are in your hands. The sense of closure that you're able to provide for the families in your hands, it just felt like a really important thing to do. So.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like you're perfectly equipped to write not just a thriller, but a very compelling one. And I think I want to dig a little bit into your characters, actually. Speaking of like the different sorts of personalities that you run into. I mentioned earlier that it's written. Okay, listen, I am a huge fan of The Secret History. So when I picked up this book and started reading, I was like, there's something familiar about this dynamic because your main character, Richard, excuse me, Cam gives a very Richard from The Secret History vibe. So I was actually pretty excited to see this sort of structure, this cleverness, this like a bit morally ambiguous group of characters that you fleshed out for your novel. And I wanted to dig in a little bit into how you created this gang of characters who are all quite different, but they have this connection that's, I don't want to say cultish, because that's not necessarily true, but they're like connected by these staffers are connected by these secrets that they share. And just, I feel like a lot of people don't see that in the day to day because it's like an exclusive club that they're a part of, which I think is why it reminded me ultimately of Donna Tartt. But I'm curious to see if Donna Tartt was of any influence, and also wanting to dig into the how you decided on the characterization, what that whole process looked like, if you sat down and sketched out the individual characters, or if you're going for something more nuanced.
Yeah, no, I absolutely did. I sat down and I was trying to think of archetypes from my Hill experience, right? This sort of, one character, Randy, is comes from this political dynasty, right? His uncle is a senator, and his father, before passing, was a famous, attorney general, a famous politician in Connecticut politics, which is where he's from. And you see on the Hill a lot of people who have like political connections, who are well connected, who get their jobs because of that, who are just perpetually interns. Right, this is like his 5th tour being an intern, not kind of wanting to grow up, not wanting to get a real job, but just sort of being a playboy and enjoying the spoils of his uncle's success. And so I just went about thinking about what are the type of characters that I see on the Hill all the time, right? And then, of course, on the opposite side, with Cam being sort of the main character, there are people who come to the Hill without a lot of money. It's hard. And I think this is why a lot of the characters are more affluent, and that sort of, is a point of distinction between Cam and the group that he's trying so desperately to become part of. Because pay is so low, a lot of the folks who are able to afford living in Washington, D.C. on such a low salary are independently wealthy, right? But then you do have, kind of like myself, people who end up on the Hill, without those either connections and certainly without the sort of, the money, you're just, trying to scrabble by, make do with the low pay. And what happens, I think, because you have such an, as you put it, it's an interesting culture. It's an exclusive club, right? People working in Congress. It's a little bit of a black box. People don't really know too much about it, but real friendships and strong connections are forged there. Often because of the late nights, the hard work that is being put into it. Sometimes the conflict again with supervisors and in particular the elected officials who can be demanding. Thankfully, the congressman who I was chief of staff for, he was great, lovely person. And so sometimes you luck out and you get really great bosses. But sometimes you don't, right? As I mentioned, there are all those stories of, bosses who throw things, who yell, and where they're recorded and it's just like really abusive, verbally abusive language toward their staff. And so a lot of really close relationships are forged there. And I wanted to expose that. I wanted to highlight that, what it's like, again, to be a young kid trying to make it in DC, working really hard, sometimes being neglected and maltreated, and how when you come together, there's something beautiful about that. Obviously, it's to come together to do something not particularly savory in this instance, since they're plotting to kill their bosses. But that was just something that was again sort of like a, let me stretch it to the limit. This sort of hatred of bosses that is kind of prevalent on the Hill. There's a mechanism in the book called Cap Hill So White. That's a site where people can go, staffers can go and anonymously complain about all the terrible things their bosses make them do. That's patterned after a real life interchange of ideas online that is similar to that. Again, because there is that sort of undercurrent of complaints, of maybe even harassment, that people are sort of dealing with together, that it's sort of known, a sort of known secret in Washington, D.C., right? That it can be particularly grueling to work on the Hill. And so I wanted to allow readers to get a peek into that. And so in terms of the characters, yeah, I looked at archetypes. I tried to develop the types of people that I saw most frequently on the Hill. And I wanted them to be a group of friends who were close. You have to believe that they're willing to sacrifice a lot. It's hard. It's hard to imagine people committing murder, nonetheless, even planning it. But I saw it in my line of work all the time. And so I know a lot of folks tend to think it's maybe far-fetched, but it really isn't. The things that drive people to hurt and kill other people are sometimes so minor. It's a comment here, it's an insecurity there. And so to really believe it, even though it happens more commonly than we think, you really through the pages needed to see these friends become sort of the really close and the only thing that they have out there in DC when you're away from your family. And so that they're willing, to kill for one another. They're willing to avenge certain things in the name of that friendship. So I'm glad you, yeah, saw the influences from The Secret History. I think that is great. It's a great novel, and I think the friendship is a really important aspect that runs through it, in addition to just the suspense and the plot.
So I'm curious because you obviously have a lot of connections on Capitol Hill. Are you excited for your friends and your colleagues to pick up this book? I mean, are you nervous? Is there just a sort of, I put this out there and I'm like, by the way, I may give some secrets away because there are definitely some camps out there somewhere. So I'm curious what for Pub Day, which is I believe next Tuesday. Congratulations. Are you? What are your overall feelings about that?
Yeah, no, I guess I'm always nervous to put out something vulnerable about yourself. Writing is a very vulnerable exercise. You're opening yourself up, of course, to critique. And that always comes with a sense of nervousness. But I'm really excited, and I think particularly the people on Capitol Hill. I'm going back to DC to give a book talk there near Capitol Hill, and so I'm excited to see folks who are junior staffers who were like me, 18 years ago, are just starting off their careers on the Hill, and hopefully can see a little bit of themselves in some of the biting commentary and some of the complaints, and some of the really bad behavior by politicians. I want them to feel seen and heard, and I want and I hope they will. I think that I'm excited to see what they have to say about it. And hopefully it's true to life. Obviously everyone's experience is different. I'm sure there are people who have markedly different experiences than I have being on Capitol Hill, but having been 6 years of my life, feels like I've gotten a pretty nice picture, both Senate and the House, and working in the committee and personal office, of what it's like to be there. And I went away for 11 years. I did it the first 4 years right out of college, and then after getting a law degree in prosecuting for 7 years, I went back in order to join the January 6th committee. And so I had that ability to see what over the course of a decade had changed on the Hill, and then what was exactly the same. And the people you meet there, great, hardworking, brilliant people. As I mentioned, sometimes people who are driven by ego, by ambition, right? There's a line in the book about how when you introduce yourself, you say your name, but then you're also supposed to say, who you work for, right? That's always, as integral to your introduction when you're meeting a stranger as your last name. It's first name, last name, who do you work for, right? And so that can be cynical. That's, part of DC that isn't always uh, pretty. It doesn't look savory, right? That everyone is always, trying to figure out what can you do for me, trying to look for networking opportunities, thinking about ways to advance their career, and so much of that sociability of meeting other folks is seen through that lens. That said, as I mentioned, I also think these are people who are craving real connection as well. DC is a very transient city. Everybody comes from somewhere else, right? Of course, there are native Washingtonians and people native certainly to the surrounding areas of Northern Virginia and Maryland. But a lot of the folks, especially who come work on the Hill, right? Because it's sort of a cross section of the whole country. There are representatives and senators from every state and every congressional district. A lot of these folks are coming from their hometowns, first time, leaving and living in a big city, and are looking for connection, are looking for friendships. And it's a great place to find really close friendships. I developed really awesome friendships my first 4 years in Washington, D.C., friends who I, still visit with and I'm still close to this day. So I think I hope that there is, funny quips about DC, but that it's seen all in the spirit in which I meant it, which was really, I call it a gruesome love letter to Washington D.C. because it really was and is still an incredible place for me. It's where I got my first job, my first opportunity, thanks to Congressman Charlie Rangel, who I'm always forever grateful for hiring me. And so I want people to see in it my affection for the place, even as I'm tearing it down a little bit.
Okay, this is a question I love to ask authors, especially when they have like that special place that they're basing their story off of or that they've had history with. So I go to Washington, D.C. What is the best bookstore and what's the best place I absolutely have to eat while I'm there?
Oh my. Okay. I'm gonna say two bookstores, East City Bookshop, and it's in part because that's where I'm going to give a talk when I return to DC the day before my book release, actually March 25th. So that's a great place. And then I also mentioned Busboys and Poets. I think that's like a really cool bookstore where you can get some food, and they've always treated me very kindly, and I enjoy them as well. In terms of places to eat, what I'll do is, because there's it's right there by Capitol Hill. It's called Talatai. It is a small Thai restaurant. I ate there, as I mentioned, when I was 21 years old, right out of college, 2007. My favorite lunch place, unassuming, affordable, really good portions, and really, really tasty Thai food. I'm pretty basic, so I ordered the chicken pad Thai, but it's amazing. And I've been told I never change it up. It's always that dish for me, but I've been told that other dishes are just as good. So I really love it there. And what was really great for me is that returning then 11 years later, I was worried, through pandemic, some other establishments there on Capitol Hill hadn't survived the pandemic. And I was really, really happy to see that my favorite lunch place was still there all that time. And it tasted the same, just as good. So a shout out to Talatai. You guys should definitely try it out.
Okay, well, I'm also curious. So you're like killing it. You're answering most of the questions I had because I wanted to dig into like the author's note, which mentions that this is a love letter to Capitol Hill, and I'm kind of like this. I feel like this is a great book to read this year, especially because it's election year, and like you're getting this raw, nuanced look at something that I don't think that I've read a thriller like it, honestly. And it's so relevant, but it's told in a way that makes something that I feel some people, oh, me particularly, I'm like not, I don't know a lot about politics. I'm gonna be honest. But like when I read this, it felt like there was this sort of mystery that's surrounding the Senate, that's surrounding the legislation. It's just like a bit lifted, and I get an insiders and a quite authentic look at it, and that is super intriguing. So I wanted to go back to crime fiction as a genre, and like really we can expand outside of crime fiction. I'm happy to do that, but I wanted to chat about your literary influences. So like as a writer and an author, what authors really inspire you when you're writing your novels, and like what are you reading outside of that? What are the books that you find yourself gravitating towards when you're not writing or when you're not doing all the badass things that you do?
I appreciate it. So I really like to read actually political nonfiction. I like hearing, or reading autobiographies, or maybe like postmortems on elections. So I was, particularly the losers. I've always been really interested in political losers, which is kind of sad. But I got interested in politics in 2000 with that election, in which there was that presidential recount, and we didn't know the outcome for several days, nearing into a month after the election had occurred. And I was 15 years old, or just about to turn 15, watching it, knowing that it was happening in my backyard. I grew up in Miami, and that's where all of the recounts were happening, and sort of the action was happening between, at the time, candidate Vice President Al Gore, and then ultimately the winner, then candidate George W. Bush. Um, and so I I've just been always interested in, yeah, in political losers, what they have to say. That's sort of graciousness in loss. You know, when Al Gore gave that concession speech after the Supreme Court had decided, you know, that there would be no more recounts and that the election would, you know, in essence, it would go to George W. Bush. I was just really moved by the fact that he, you know, Al Gore did put country above himself and his self-interest, and conceded, you know, even though people were asking him, telling him to fight, he didn't undermine the Supreme Court decision. He didn't call it illegitimate. You know, he said he personally disagreed with it, of course, but ultimately he would respect that. And that's the tradition of this country, right? Peaceful transfers of power. So the fact that that was sort of my induction into politics, what made me sort of love it, really circled back when January 6th happened and I had the opportunity to go work on that committee. It was quite, you know, full circle, because of course that was a case of what I call the first non-peaceful transfer of power, right? That was the case of somebody refusing to concede, refusing to acknowledge the election results. That was somebody who wasn't putting, you know, the country above their self-interest, and so that was quite interesting to me. In terms of, so those type of books I really like, again, written from the perspective of people who really try hard to, you know, attain elected office and come just short. In terms of growing up, my literary influences, I really, really loved Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Really big fan of his, and I think, you know, I like strong characters, you know, people who either you recognize in real life, people who are maybe not, again, not the best liked. Maybe I have a rather dim view of humanity that I like unlikable characters. But I think a lot of us see ourselves in those folks, people who are deeply flawed, who aren't perfect and don't always know the right things to say or do in every situation. And so I'm drawn to that. I'm a big fan of William Faulkner, which is, you know, it's sometimes very difficult to read, get through, and so I like that. I like novels that kind of make you work for it, where everything isn't spoon-fed for you, and you kind of have to work to figure out maybe a puzzle. I think that's what led me to sort of want to do thrillers and mysteries. It's, you know, getting to subvert expectations and lead someone down a pathway, and then, you know, pulling the rug out from under them. And so I think that maybe was an influence of stream of consciousness and how that can sort of jar you and throw you from what you were expecting. So I love that. And then now I just try to read as much as possible, you know, in the genre. I'm reading Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead, who's a nice, kind friend of mine. And it's going great. I love it. And so I think just trying as hard as possible to read as many different things. You know, I'm a lawyer, so I'm really interested in writing legal scholarship. I teach. And so at the law schools at the University of Miami currently, previously at Georgetown. And so I just think, you know, being exposed to different types of writing, reading, is really helpful. It's really helpful in developing your narrative voice, because ultimately, I think no matter what you're writing, you're trying to make it engaging. You're trying to keep the reader's attention. If you're writing to a judge, even though it's a little drier, right, it's emotion potentially. But I tell my students, my legal writing students, that it still is the same. It's still a story. It's still a narrative. It still needs a beginning, middle, and end. It still needs to capture the attention of your reader. And so I just find that throughout all the types of writing, there's that singular thread. You know, it isn't all that different for one another. And so I try to exercise that muscle as much as possible in as many different fields as I can.
Awesome. So you seem quite conscientious. You have a lot of history in like studying rigorously. I'm curious what like let's sit down and look at a day of writing in your perspective. What does that look like? And when you were specifically writing One in the Chamber, I'm curious where that started for you. Did it start with the character Cam? Did it start with the idea? Did it start with like, I want to write something about Capitol Hill? Did it start with the ending? I'm curious to dig into your writing process.
Yeah, and so I know that there are many people who write really intense, detailed outlines before they get going, and I don't do that at all. I do have a little note book that I just sort of sketch out in my mind. Some, if I have ideas, I'll put them down, but they aren't particularly ordered, and it certainly isn't sort of like a map. I sort of know where I'm starting, and then I know where I'm ending, and then I kind of just let the process lead me there. I want to sort of develop the story as the reader would, not kind of knowing where it's going, but just sort of being led and pulled as I continue to write. And so sometimes, I start off with a vague notion of how we're gonna get to where we're going. I always know where we're going. So that's, the ending is usually something that I have sketched out in my mind. Although with One in the Chamber, actually, there was sort of like an additional pivot. There's like kind of a couple of pivots, and I think the sort of additional last pivot was actually something that did kind of come to me in the middle of the writing process. So I generally, again, know where I'm going, but sometimes I'm influenced and inspired to go in a slightly different direction. And so that's always been really, really great. In terms of just the idea and how it came to me, again, I knew I wanted to say something about Capitol Hill, about Capitol Hill culture, and I knew I was going to incorporate, as I mentioned, the sort of personalities and egos of elected officials, and how junior staffers perceive them and are perceived by them. And then I figured, then I had to develop through whose eyes did we want to see this. And one thing that, you mentioned from my first book to my second book, was there something I learned, the first book really was kind of like an ensemble piece, right? By definition, I needed it to be, because I wanted to look through the eyes of each juror and see how their past experiences would affect how they think about the case. And therefore, you needed multiple perspectives to do that, right? There are, thankfully, only 6 jurors, 1 alternate in Miami juries, when you're not dealing with capital cases. If it had been 12, that would have been way too many. So I was happy that in Florida, at least, it's a smaller pool of jurors that we're looking at. So with this one, the difference is, I was like, let me drill down on one person. One person is going to be telling this story, right? I didn't want, obviously there's a group of characters, a group of friends, but it's all seen through the eyes of Cam, as you mentioned. And so I wanted to develop a person who we come to learn things about him as we go along. I didn't want it to be that we knew immediately who this person was. He needed to be a little bit of an enigma. He needed to be a little bit of a blank slate, right? And that's kind of what the group of friends really like about him. He notes, right, that you can sort of project whatever you want onto him, and he becomes that thing. Whatever it is that you needed in that moment, he becomes that type of friend. And so I needed him to be that, in order for us to go on this journey to learn about him, and then by the end, know him in and out, know him completely. And I wanted to keep sort of the motivations that he has and that some of his friends have, secret, right? I didn't want from the beginning everyone to know, okay, this is why ultimately the ending is going to happen. As I mentioned, right from the first page, there's a dead senator, right? I wanted it to sort of, pull the wool up over or under people's eyes, I suppose, little by little, gradually. And so I think Cam was a good vehicle for that. Sort of a nondescript, everyday American male, like, again, someone on whom you can project whatever it is you want him to be, until, of course, you figure out who he is. And I think that's the fun in that.
So I had one final question,
Okay.
and it's one I've been wanting to ask the most, which is, can you tell us, what are you planning next? Are you writing a third book? Please write a third book.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, yeah, I am. I am going back a little bit to my legal thriller roots. I am writing, currently set again in Miami, as with Prejudice was, a sort of it's about police and prosecutors, and maybe the kind that aren't on the up and up, that aren't doing the right things, that are who are corrupt, who are gaming the system. And so really focuses on these two men, one a first year prosecutor, another one a rookie cop, and how they sort of forge a friendship and also a rivalry, and sort of get locked into this sort of mutually assured destruction, with all of the basically blackmail they have on each other, because they're operating outside of the bounds of the law. And so I'm really excited about it, and it's early days, so it's the most fun part, I think, of the process, since, as I mentioned, I'm sort of letting it roll and letting the process dictate where I go. But that's where I'm at right now. So hopefully, you guys will get that not in the not too distant future.
Awesome. That is very exciting to hear. So, if I haven't flashed it enough, One in the Chamber, it comes out on the 26th. And thank you so much for chatting with me.
Oh, thank you so much, Lauren. I appreciate it.
It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you both for gracing our virtual halls. Robin, congratulations on a great second novel. Lauren, thank you for doing the honors today. I'd like to remind everyone we have posted links with which you may purchase both of Robin's books. Better yet, if you're in the hood, come on down, pay us a visit, browse our stacks. We're one of the country's great browsing experiences. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district and open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., getting back to our pre-pandemic hours. Today's program has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through our public events, community outreach, and our publishing program, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So goodbye, everyone. Take care. We hope to see you all again soon.